Time to dig up the main ideas. I'm Sparky, and we're about to fetch a quick summary of Beneath the Surface, a guide to Belizean caves and ecosystem preservation. To understand the magnificent cave systems of Belize, we have to start with a journey that begins high in the sky. It all starts with a single raindrop. As rain falls through our atmosphere, it doesn't stay pure water for long. Instead, it performs a subtle chemical dance with the air around it. As these droplets descend, they begin to pick up carbon dioxide, or CO2, from the atmosphere. This interaction creates a very weak, diluted solution known as carbonic acid. While we might think of acid as something volatile or immediate, carbonic acid is gentle, yet its persistence is what eventually reshapes the very foundations of the Earth.
The process intensifies once that rainwater hits the ground. As the water seeps into the earth, it passes through the topsoil, which is filled with tiny air pockets. These pockets are incredibly rich in carbon dioxide, far more so than the open air above, because of the decaying organic matter and root respiration happening just beneath the surface. As the water trickles through the CO2-rich environment, the concentration of carbonic acid increases. The more carbon dioxide the water encounters, the more potent this weak acid becomes.
This is the primary agent of change for the Belizean landscape, which is largely built upon a massive foundation of limestone. Limestone is composed primarily of calcium carbonate, a substance that is particularly vulnerable to acidic solutions. When this carbonic acid makes contact with the limestone, a slow-motion chemical reaction occurs. The acid begins to dissolve the calcium carbonate, essentially eating away at the rock molecule by molecule. Because limestone is naturally filled with tiny cracks, crevices, and fissures, the acidic water has a ready-made map to follow. It trickles and seeps deeper into the earth, widening these small openings very gradually over thousands of years. This downward migration continues until the water hits a barrier it cannot dissolve. In Belize, this might be a layer of non-porous clay or a hard, impervious bedrock like granite. When the water can no longer move vertically, it begins to pool and flow horizontally, accelerating the dissolution of the limestone and eventually hollowing out the massive caverns and underground chambers that we see today. It is a remarkable reminder that the grand architecture of the underworld isn't created by sudden force, but by the quiet, relentless chemistry of rainwater and carbon dioxide working in perfect, ancient harmony. Every time you stand in a Belizean cave, you are standing inside a void created by this invisible chemical process, where the sky literally dissolved the stone. To understand how the massive, winding caverns of Belize were formed, we have to look at two distinct but related geological processes: chemical dissolution and mechanical erosion. The vast majority of these systems are what geologists call solution caves. This process begins long before water ever reaches the underground. As rain falls through the atmosphere and trickles through the organic matter in the soil, it picks up carbon dioxide. This mixture creates a weak carbonic acid. While it is not strong enough to harm a person, it is perfectly suited to dissolve limestone, which is primarily composed of calcium carbonate. Belize is particularly susceptible to this because of its thick layers of limestone. The acid finds its way into the earth through tiny cracks and fissures in the rock. Over thousands of years, this continuous downward flow eats away at the rock, weakening the substrate and widening those small crevices into massive underground chambers. What makes this process fascinating is how the water behaves when it hits a roadblock. As the acid solution seeps down, it eventually encounters non-porous materials like clay or hard, impervious bedrock, such as granite. Because the water cannot pass through these harder materials, it begins to collect and flow horizontally, carving out caverns at different levels. If you have ever walked through a cave and noticed different tiers or levels, you are seeing the history of the water table. As the water table rose and fell over millennia, the acid water eroded the limestone from the bottom up and the top down, creating complex, multi-leveled systems. While chemical dissolution creates the space, underground rivers act as the master architects that shape the tunnels. This is known as abrasive erosion. Unlike the slow chemical dissolving of the rock, abrasive erosion is a mechanical process. Underground rivers carry sediments like sand and small rounded stones. As the water rushes through the limestone passages, these sediments act like sandpaper, grinding against the walls and floors to smooth out and widen the tunnels. Even in caves where the river has long since disappeared, you can still find evidence of this power in the form of polished rock surfaces and deposits of smooth, river-worn pebbles left behind on the cave floor. A perfect example of this in Belize is the Rio Frio Cave. When you visit, you are looking at the remnants of an underground river system that was once vastly larger than the stream flowing through it today. The cave is open at both ends, which is a clear geological sign that the original tunnel was once much longer, but eventually suffered a roof collapse due to the sheer scale of the erosion. The massive arched entrance of Rio Frio stands as a monument to the combined power of carbonic acid dissolving the calcium carbonate and the mechanical force of an ancient river carving its way through the mountain. By understanding these two forces, we can see that a cave isn't just a static hole in the ground. It is a dynamic environment shaped by the persistent, patient interaction between water and stone. When we look at the Belizean landscape, some of its most breathtaking features are not the mountains or the forests, but the sudden, dramatic openings in the earth, known as cenotes and sinkholes. These geological wonders are much more than simple pits in the ground. They are windows into the vast, hidden world of underground river systems. To understand how they form, we have to look back at the work of carbonic acid. Over thousands of years, this weak acid, created by rainwater mixing with carbon dioxide, trickles through the cracks and fissures of the limestone. It slowly dissolves the calcium carbonate, eating away at the rock substrate from the inside out. This process creates massive underground chambers or caverns. Eventually, the limestone ceiling above these hollowed-out spaces becomes too thin and weak to support its own weight. When the roof finally gives way, it collapses into the cavern below, creating the circular opening we recognize as a cenote. A prime example of this process is found at the Blue Hole National Park on the Hummingbird Highway. This terrestrial sinkhole marks the presence of a larger underground river system. When you stand at the edge of its sapphire waters, you are actually looking at a small portion of a river that is mostly hidden from the surface. The steep walls around the water are the remaining evidence of a cave roof that collapsed long ago. If you could see the entire system, you would find winding tunnels shaped by the abrasive erosion of flowing water, leaving behind sand and rounded stones as proof of its power. Perhaps the most iconic example of a collapsed cave system is the Great Blue Hole located at the center of Lighthouse Reef Atoll. This massive marine sinkhole drops to a depth of over 120 meters, or about 400 feet. What makes this site so fascinating is its history as a dry cave. During the ice ages, when sea levels were significantly lower, this was a terrestrial cavern where dripstone formations could grow in the open air. As the ice age ended and the sea rose, the cave system was submerged, and eventually the roof collapsed to create the perfectly circular abyss we see today. For the ancient Maya, these cenotes were not just geological curiosities, they were vital for survival. In northern Belize and the Yucatan Peninsula, where surface water is often scarce, cenotes provided essential access to the underground water table. The cultural importance of these sites is even reflected in local place names, such as Sarteneja, where the suffix ha means water in the Maya language. While the Maya often viewed these deep, dark openings as frightening gateways to the underworld of Xibalba, they were also forced to descend into them to retrieve the water needed for their communities. Whether found in the middle of the jungle or out in the turquoise sea, these sinkholes serve as a reminder of the continuous, invisible power of water and acid as they reshape the limestone foundation of Belize. As we step further into the heart of the Belizean landscape, we encounter the magnificent architectural wonders of the underworld. The interior of a limestone cave is not just a hollow space, it is a gallery of intricate structures, known as speleothems. These formations are the result of a slow, rhythmic dance between water and mineral that has persisted for thousands of years. To understand how these shapes appear, we must first look at the process of calcium carbonate precipitation. As rainwater, which has been transformed into a weak carbonic acid, trickles through the limestone above a cave, it dissolves the calcium carbonate within the rock. Once this mineral-rich solution reaches the open air of a cave chamber, the carbon dioxide escapes, and the dissolved minerals are forced back into a solid state. This is how the cave literally builds itself, one drop at a time. The most iconic of these structures are stalactites and stalagmites. You can identify stalactites by their position. They are the downward projecting icicle-like formations that hang from the ceiling. A helpful way to remember them is that stalactites must hold tight to the roof so they don't fall. They begin as a single drop of water, leaving behind a tiny ring of calcite that eventually grows into a long, thin tube. Directly beneath these hanging spikes, you will often find stalagmites. These are columns that project upward from the cave floor. When the mineral-heavy water falls from a stalactite and hits the ground, the impact causes the water to splash, depositing the remaining calcium carbonate in a wider, more rounded pile. Because of this splashing action, stalagmites are typically thicker and less pointed than their counterparts on the ceiling. They might eventually reach the top, which is a great way to remember their name. When a stalactite growing down and a stalagmite growing up finally meet, they fuse together to form a pillar, which is also commonly referred to as a column. These massive structures can span the entire height of a cavern, appearing like the grand supports of a subterranean cathedral. However, the artistry of the cave doesn't stop at vertical spikes. We also see sheet flowstone, which creates some of the most exotic shapes in the Belizean underground. Flowstone occurs when water does not drip, but instead flows in thin, continuous sheets over the walls or floors of a cave. As the minerals precipitate out of this moving film of water, they create smooth, undulating deposits that look like frozen waterfalls, shimmering curtains, or even delicate folds of cloth. In sites like Rio Frio and Barton Creek caves, these flowstones can take on exotic shapes resembling pools of clouds. What makes these formations truly awe-inspiring is the immense timescale required for their creation. In our study, we noted that these structures grow at an incredibly slow rate, often as little as 1/16 of an inch every 100 years. This means that a formation only a few inches long has been in progress since before the rise of many ancient civilizations. This extreme age is why conservation is so vital. The simple act of a human hand touching a formation can transfer skin oils that permanently stunt its growth or discolor the sparkling white calcite. Whether it is a massive pillar in the Chickabule system or a delicate flowstone sheet in Rio Frio, these formations are a fragile, ancient record of Belize's geological history, representing a process that began long before we entered these sacred spaces. Imagine diving into the crystal-clear depths of the Great Blue Hole or the submerged caverns beneath Kai Kalker. As your flashlight cuts through the darkness, you see something that seems impossible. Massive stone icicles hanging from the ceiling and pillars rising from the floor. These are stalactites and stalagmites, collectively known as dripstone. To a casual observer, they are just beautiful rock formations, but to a geologist, they are a profound record of Earth's history and a key to understanding the ancient climate of Belize. To understand why these formations are so significant, we first have to look at how they are created. These features form when rainwater, turned into a weak carbonic acid, seeps through limestone and picks up calcium carbonate. When a drop of this mineral-rich water reaches the ceiling of a dry cave, it leaves behind a tiny bit of calcite before falling to the floor. Over centuries, this rhythmic dripping builds the formations we see. However, there is a fundamental rule in geology. These dripstone formations cannot form underwater. The chemical process of precipitation requires the presence of air. If a cave is flooded, the water cannot drip and the minerals cannot crystallize in this specific icicle-like way. This means that every submerged stalactite you see in the Belizean blue holes is definitive proof that these caves were once dry, airy chambers. They stand as silent witnesses to a time when sea levels were drastically lower than they are today. Most of these formations were created during the Ice Ages, a period that ended roughly 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. During that time, vast amounts of the Earth's water were frozen in massive glaciers, causing the global sea level to drop by hundreds of feet. The caves we now explore with scuba gear were once high and dry, allowing the slow sculpturing of the limestone to occur over thousands of years of dry periods. What makes the Belizean submerged caves even more fascinating is that many of these formations are not perfectly vertical. In the massive caverns beneath Kai Kalker and at depths of about 132 feet in the Great Blue Hole at Lighthouse Reef Atoll, divers have documented dripstones that tilt at odd angles. Since gravity ensures that a dripping stalactite always grows straight down, any tilt is evidence of what happened after the formation was created. These off-vertical positions provide clear evidence of continued Earth movement and tectonic shifts that have occurred since the caves first formed. As the planet warmed and the glaciers melted, the sea levels rose, flooding these caverns and preserving the tilted stones in a watery grave. These submerged landmarks serve as a geological clock, allowing researchers to map out exactly how the sea has risen and how the physical landscape of the Caribbean has shifted over millennia. When you look at an off-vertical stalactite 40 meters below the ocean's surface, you are looking at a snapshot of a world that existed before the sea claimed the land. When we step away from the light and enter the deep, lightless chambers of a Belizean cave system, we encounter a world where the rules of survival are fundamentally altered. In this environment, life is categorized by how much an organism relies on the cave itself. Biologists generally distinguish between different groups based on their level of dependency, primarily looking at trogloxines and troglophophile. Trogloxines, often called cave guests, are animals that use the cave as a temporary refuge but cannot complete their entire life cycle within its walls.
The most famous examples in Belize are bats. These creatures rely on the cave for protection and sleep during the day, but they must exit every night to forage for food, whether they are fruit-eating bats or those that hunt insects and fish. Despite their part-time status, trogloxines are vital to the cave ecosystem because they act as a biological bridge, bringing in external energy. Their waste, known as guano, acts as a primary fertilizer that fuels the rest of the cave's food chain, supporting fungi and small insects.
On the other hand, we have troglophiles, or cave lovers. These organisms are highly adapted to the dark and can spend their entire lives inside a cave, although they are still capable of surviving in similar dark, moist environments on the surface, such as under rotting logs or deep soil. However, the most extreme residents are the troglobites, which are entirely restricted to the dark zone and can never leave. These species have undergone fascinating evolutionary changes to thrive where there is zero sunlight. The blind cavefish and eyeless shrimp found in Belizean underground rivers are perfect examples of this specialized evolution. Since eyes require significant biological energy to develop and maintain, these species have simply done away with them over thousands of years. In the pitch black, sight is a useless luxury. Instead, these animals have heightened their other senses to an incredible degree. Blind cavefish use specialized sensory organs to detect minute changes in water pressure and vibrations, allowing them to navigate and hunt without ever seeing their prey. Similarly, cave-dwelling spiders and shrimp often possess elongated legs and antennae, which act as highly sensitive feelers to navigate the rocky terrain. Even the plant life is different here. Because photosynthesis is impossible without sunlight, you won't find green plants in a cave. Instead, fungi take center stage. Lacking chlorophyll, these organisms feed on the decaying matter, or detritus, washed in by underground rivers or deposited by the residents. From the tiny remipedes discovered in submerged coastal caves to the bats using echolocation to navigate the tunnels, every species represents a masterclass in adaptation, turning a seemingly inhospitable void into a thriving, interconnected community. By understanding these creatures, we see how life persists in even the most challenging conditions. For the ancient Maya, caves were far more than just interesting geological formations. They were profound spiritual thresholds. They believed these dark subterranean passages were the literal gateways to Xibalba, a name that translates to the place of fright. In Mayan cosmology, the universe was divided into layers, and caves served as the critical link between the earthly plane and the subterranean realm of powerful deities and ancestors. To enter a cave was to leave the world of the living and step into a sacred, supernatural space. This belief made caves central to the religious and social life of the Maya for centuries. Because of this connection to the underworld, caves became primary sites for intense ceremonial activities. The archaeological evidence across Belize tells a vivid story of this devotion. Researchers have identified over 200 burials across at least 20 different cave systems in the country. These were not simple interments. They were often elaborate rituals intended to bridge the gap between life and death. In many deeper chambers, you can still find skeletal remains that have become part of the cave itself. Over hundreds of years, the dripping, mineral-rich water has petrified or calcified these remains, essentially turning them into stone. These calcified figures serve as a permanent, haunting testament to the rituals and sacrifices performed to appease the gods of Xibalba. Beyond their spiritual role, caves also served an incredibly practical and life-sustaining purpose as vital water reservoirs. In the northern regions of Belize and across the Yucatan Peninsula, limestone geography means that surface water like lakes and rivers can be very scarce. The Maya recognized that caves often held deep, protected pools of water. They would descend into these dark, often frightening depths to collect the water necessary for their survival. You can still see the importance of water in the linguistic history of the region. For example, the name of the village Sarteneja ends with the syllable ha, which is the Mayan word for water. This created a fascinating cultural tension. The Maya were forced to brave the spiritual dangers of the underworld to obtain the very resource they needed to sustain life on the surface. The spiritual legacy of these sites continues to influence Belizean culture through folklore. Many people still share stories of mythical creatures like the duende, a small hat-wearing spirit, or the sisamite, who are said to inhabit the remote cave systems in the deep bush. Because these caves are both archaeological treasures and the final resting places of ancestors, modern cave guiding in Belize requires a high degree of cultural sensitivity. Professional guides often practice a tradition of showing deep respect, sometimes offering a silent prayer or a formal word of permission before entering a cavern. This practice ensures that visitors are not just seeing a natural wonder, but are honoring the sacred history and the spirits that the Maya believed have occupied these spaces since the beginning of time. When we look at the threats facing Belizean habitats, it is essential to distinguish between natural events and human activities. While a hurricane or a wildfire might be devastating, these natural impacts are often short-term, allowing the ecosystem a chance to eventually recover. In contrast, human-driven changes frequently lead to long-term habitat degradation or the outright destruction of the landscape. The most significant threat to our dry terrestrial ecosystems is the large-scale removal of vegetation, commonly known as deforestation. This is not just about losing trees, it is about breaking the intricate biological connections that hold an environment together. Deforestation in Belize happens for several primary reasons, ranging from small-scale subsistence farming to massive industrial projects. We see this clearly in the expansion of export crops like sugar, citrus, and bananas, as well as the growth of shrimp farming, which often targets sensitive savanna habitats near the coast. Even the traditional milpa system, while often perceived as temporary, can have a cumulative negative effect. Over time, repeated clearing and burning can strip the soil of its essential minerals. This process eventually leaves the earth sterile, allowing the underlying rocks to show through and preventing the original forest from returning. When we clear the land for housing developments or logging, we are removing the biological anchors that protect the very foundation of the ecosystem. This brings us to the critical issue of soil degradation. Without the protective canopy and the complex root systems of native plants, the soil is left completely vulnerable to the elements. During Belize's heavy rain events, water picks up these loose soil particles and carries them away in a process called erosion. This does not just leave the land less fertile for future growth, it moves that sediment into our creeks and rivers, which can choke aquatic life and alter the flow of our waterways. This highlights a fundamental truth in ecology. All systems are connected by air and water processes. What we do to the forest on a hillside eventually impacts the quality of the water in the valley below. Beyond the soil itself, we must consider the devastating impact of habitat loss and fragmentation. As we build new roads, expand villages, and increase tourism infrastructure, we are shrinking and splitting the spaces where wildlife can survive. Animals like the jaguar are increasingly being pushed out of their natural territories because their shelter and food sources have disappeared. When we build our homes in places where these creatures have lived for millennia, we create a conflict where the animals have nowhere else to go. Even tourism, which we often view as a sustainable industry, can be damaging if not managed with care. Excessive noise, off-trail wandering, and improper garbage disposal all contribute to the displacement of sensitive species. Understanding these human-driven threats is the first step toward better land use planning. If we do not account for the long-term impact of how we develop our land, we risk losing the very ecosystems that provide us with essential services we simply cannot replace ourselves. When we look at the health of Belizean waterways, we have to recognize that every ecosystem is connected through the movement of water. What happens upstream rarely stays there, and human activities have introduced significant stressors to these aquatic systems. One of the most permanent changes we impose on a river is damming. While dams provide vital electricity in water reservoirs, they fundamentally alter the river's biology. Upstream, vast areas of terrestrial habitat are drowning flora and fauna. Downstream, the river may face complete drying or a severely reduced volume, which destroys the specialized life cycles of fish and other organisms that have evolved over thousands of years. Beyond just the flow of water, dams act as traps for sediment. As organic material like trees and grass rots behind a dam, it creates two major hidden threats: the production of methane gas and the buildup of mercury. Mercury accumulates in the water through organic decomposition and eventually enters the food chain, where it poses a direct risk to humans who consume the fish. Furthermore, the reduced flow between a dam and its turbines causes the water to become shallower and warmer. This temperature shift, combined with increased sunlight penetration, allows moss and algae to choke the riverbed, fundamentally changing the water quality. This leads us to the broader issue of organic pollution, which stems from agriculture, industry, and domestic sewage. In Belize, this often takes the form of livestock excrement, sugarcane slurry, or fruit peels from processing plants. When these organic materials enter a slow-moving or stagnant river, they act as a massive dose of fertilizer. This triggers a process called eutrophication, where excess algae and fleshy plants like water hyacinths grow so rapidly that they cloud the water and block light. The most devastating result is a fish kill. As bacteria work to decompose this massive influx of organic matter, they consume all the available dissolved oxygen in the water, leaving none for the fish, who effectively suffocate. For humans, this organic load is equally dangerous. Gray water and sewage runoff introduce harmful bacteria into the river system, leading to skin infections and gastric diseases for those who rely on the river for washing or drinking. Even natural phenomena like the massive influx of sargassum seaweed contribute to this, as its decomposition produces stinking gases and skin irritants that affect both marine life and coastal communities. Finally, we must evaluate chemical pollution, a more insidious threat because it is often invisible. Pesticides from large-scale farms, industrial chemicals, and heavy metals can seep through the soil in a process called leaching, eventually reaching our lagoons and rivers. Even tourism plays a role. When thousands of visitors enter the water wearing sunscreens and oils, those chemicals can damage coral reefs and interfere with the oxygen exchange of aquatic species. For humans and wildlife alike, the consequences of chemical runoff are severe, ranging from immediate poisoning to long-term immunosuppression, which reduces the body's ability to fight off disease. Whether it is the physical barrier of a dam, the oxygen-starving effect of organic waste, or the toxic legacy of chemical runoff, these human-driven impacts create a cycle of degradation that threatens the very water systems that sustain Belizean life. Understanding these impacts is the first step toward more responsible management and the preservation of our vital aquatic resources. Transitioning from the various threats facing Belizean ecosystems, we look toward the solutions being implemented to preserve these vital landscapes. A cornerstone of these efforts is the National Biological Corridors Initiative, or the NBCI. This is a relatively modern approach to conservation that recognizes a simple truth: protected areas cannot exist as isolated islands of green. For ecosystems to remain healthy and for wildlife to thrive, there must be connectivity. The NBCI focuses on linking these protected areas by encouraging local communities to safeguard the forested corridors that run between them. Many of these areas currently lack official protection status, making them vulnerable to the human-driven pressures of logging, housing development, and agricultural expansion. The genius of the initiative lies in its focus on community-led protection. Rather than imposing top-down restrictions that might alienate local residents, the project works directly with villages situated near these vital corridors. The goal is to help them initiate development projects and income-generating schemes that are actually complementary to the forest. A perfect example of this is the shift toward ecotourism and specialized birding expeditions. Instead of clearing land for traditional milpa farming, which can lead to soil sterilization and habitat loss over time, landowners are encouraged to preserve the primary forest to attract species like the scarlet macaw. This allows communities to move forward economically without moving backward environmentally. As mentioned in the lecture, these corridors offer a way for people to develop their land for the benefit of nature, providing an alternative to the cycle of deforestation. This approach is the very definition of sustainable development. It acknowledges that human beings need to earn a living, but it challenges us to do so in a way that respects the services ecosystems provide, services that we simply cannot replicate for ourselves. For instance, these forested corridors act as natural filters for our river systems and serve as buffers against the catastrophic flooding caused by heavy rains and soil erosion. When we protect a corridor, we are not just saving trees. We are securing the natural infrastructure that supports human health, provides clean water, and maintains the delicate balance of our climate. As we have seen, these initiatives are sometimes met with skepticism, but their success is essential for the long-term survival of Belize's biodiversity. The Corridor Initiative gives people the opportunity to own their role as stewards of the land. By viewing the jungle not as an obstacle to be cleared, but as a resource to be managed, local guides and community members become the front line of conservation. This holistic view of protection, linking habitats and people together, is what will ultimately ensure that the surface habitats and the hidden cave systems beneath them remain intact for generations to come. It reminds us that our responsibility as guides and citizens is to respect the environment as a living temple, ensuring that our development today does not compromise the natural heritage of tomorrow.